You know the stories from the Old Testament, right? These incredible epic tales. Abraham's journey, the escape from Egypt, David and Goliath. For centuries, pretty much everyone just took these as literal eyewitness history. But modern archaeology and historical research have uncovered this massive puzzle. There's this huge gaping hole between the stories the Bible tells and the actual physical evidence we can find.
So, that leads to the big question, the one that scholars have been wrestling with for decades. If these incredible stories aren't straight-up history, then what are they? Well, today we're going to dive into one of the leading theories that tries to solve that exact puzzle. Okay, let's start with probably the most famous story of all, the Exodus. Now, the Bible describes 2 million people, let me say that again, 2 million people escaping Egypt and then wandering the Sinai desert for 40 years. To put that in perspective, that's like the entire city of Houston suddenly picking up and moving. You'd expect some evidence, right? And yet, the actual hard archaeological proof for this massive event is, well, it's nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no trace in Egyptian records, not a single campsite found, no pottery shards, just silence. So what's going on here? How do you explain that?
Well, to explain this gap, a lot of scholars have put forward this really fascinating idea. They argue that maybe we're looking at these stories all wrong. What if they aren't failed history, but actually incredibly successful charter myths? And the best way to think about that is to imagine it's like a nation's official founding film.
So what's a charter myth? Put simply, it's a foundational story that basically gives a community its identity. You know, it answers all the big questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? What makes us us? And what gives us the right to our laws and our land? The main point here isn't to be 100% historically accurate. No, the goal is something else entirely. It's to create this powerful sense of unity and shared identity.
And that founding film analogy, it's just perfect. Think about it. A charter myth might use characters and places that feel familiar, but the plot is specifically designed to inspire national unity and to justify why things are the way they are right now. In the end, what really, truly matters is the message the story is sending, not whether every single historical detail lines up.
All right, let's put this theory to the test. We're going to look at our first case file, the stories of the Patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob from the book of Genesis. The idea here is that these stories are working as a kind of political allegory.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because it's the tiny details that act like historical fingerprints. See, the stories are set way back around 2000 BCE, but they're packed with things that just didn't exist in that region until way, way later. I'm talking about stuff like large-scale domesticated camel caravans and, yep, the Philistines. These are what historians call anachronisms, things that are out of their proper time, and they're huge clues that these stories were actually written down centuries after the events they're supposed to be describing.
So if they were written later, what was the political purpose? This is where the charter part of charter myth really clicks into place. First off, these stories were a brilliant way to unify a bunch of separate, squabbling tribal traditions into one big national family. Second, they made some pretty specific political claims. By making Abraham the great-great-grandfather of everyone and then linking him specifically to Hebron, which was in the southern kingdom of Judah, the story subtly elevates Judah's importance over the northern tribes. And finally, maybe most importantly, these stories act like a divine title deed to the land. I mean, what a powerful legal and spiritual claim to have when you're trying to define your territory.
Okay, next up, the big one. Case file number 2, the Exodus from Egypt. If this massive event didn't happen the way the Bible describes it, then what on earth was the purpose of telling such a powerful central story?
And let's just really let this sink in for a second. We're talking about a century of archaeologists digging all over the Sinai Peninsula, actively looking for any trace, and the sum total of evidence they found for a 40-year migration of millions of people is 0. A big, fat 0. Not a single campsite, not one broken piece of pottery, nothing. It's this complete and utter silence that forces us to ask that question again. If the Exodus isn't history, what is it?
Well, according to this theory, the crucial point is its function. What did the story do for the people telling it? For one thing, the Exodus story created this incredibly powerful identity for the early Israelites. It set them apart, made them distinct from their Canaanite neighbors. But even more than that, it was an absolutely incredible story of hope. Just imagine you're part of this tiny little kingdom constantly being threatened by these massive superpowers like Assyria and Babylon. A story where your God humbles and defeats the greatest empire on earth? That's not just a story. That's a powerful tool for survival and resistance.
All right,
Our final case file looks at the creation of a national golden age. We're talking about the stories of a swift, total military conquest of Canaan and the glorious, sprawling, united kingdom of David and Solomon.
And you guessed it, here again we see this really dramatic gap between the biblical story and the archaeological record. The text paints this picture of a massive Golden Age empire under David and Solomon. But the actual evidence we can dig up from that period, it points to something, well, a lot smaller. A pretty modest kingdom up in the hills, with Jerusalem being more like a small town or a tribal center than some grand imperial capital. The story is absolutely epic, but the reality on the ground seems to have been much, much more humble.
So why tell this grand Golden Age story? What was its purpose? Well, it was an incredibly powerful political tool. For one, it gave later kings, like a guy named Josiah, a kind of historical blueprint to justify their own ambitions to expand and rule over all Israel. The violent conquest stories also worked as a pretty stark warning against mixing with other cultures and religions. And maybe the most powerful function of all, the memory of this glorious unified past under a king like David offered this profound hope for a future messianic king who would come and restore that glory. That was an especially powerful idea during the darkest days of exile.
Okay, so after digging into these case files, what's the big takeaway from this scholarly perspective? What's the verdict? Really, it all boils down to one thing: the incredible, undeniable power of a good story.
The main idea is this: these foundational stories were never meant to be dry, historical records filed away in an archive. No way. They were crafted to be something more like a national constitution, but written in the form of a story. They were, in essence, a brilliant survival strategy designed from the ground up to forge a resilient, unified people who could survive anything: invasion, exile, and the constant threat of just being wiped off the map.
And thinking about it this way leaves us with a really deep question, one that goes way beyond just these ancient texts. Think about any nation, any community, any group of people. What's ultimately more essential for their survival? A perfectly factual, 100% accurate history, or a powerful, unifying story that inspires them to build a future?